to witness Palestinian capacity and insistence on love, survivance, resilience, hope. Sumud as a word that grows and grows to the point where it becomes untranslatable. The scenes of the return of Palestinians to North Gaza. This is one in particular of this old man. He says, "This is the return of the soul. I recognize that I am returning to rubble, but it is a return. I will make the return."
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time zone you're living in, it's time for Sumud. All about humanity, so this right here for everyone. Uplift, amplify, empower everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time zone you're living in, it's time for Sumud.
On this episode of the Sumud Podcast, we uplift, empower, and amplify Dr. Fady Joudah. Dr. Joudah is an award-winning Palestinian-American writer, poet, translator, and physician, a true doctor of medicine and metaphor. His poetry bridges healing and art, gently weaving in themes of exile, identity, and resilience with lyrical mastery. As a healer of both bodies and language, he infuses his work with profound depth and humanity. Through his writing, he continues to amplify Palestinian voices and explore the universal struggles of displacement and belonging.
Welcome, Dr. Fady. It's such a pleasure and an honor to have you with us today.
Thank you, Zainab.
I want to say before we get started here, writing your intro was very difficult because you are so many different things and you represent so many different forms. I just wanted you to know it was very difficult to write any intro, hyphenations, Palestinian-American, whatever it may be, because your contributions to our community has been so great. So thank you for that.
Thank you for seeing it that way. All of our contributions without each other are utterly wasted. I don't exist without you, and nor you without me.
So I just wanted to, if you're okay, start with your early life, just to tell the audience a little bit where you came from and how you grew up. And I know that you were a son of Palestinian refugees and grew up in Libya and Saudi, but I believe born in Texas, if I'm not mistaken. Texas and Saudi Arabia are two really distinct areas, obviously different areas. Can you just talk about that experience in growing up?
Yeah, I don't know how to say it in a few minutes, but I wanted to say instinctively when you said where you came from, and I said, I came from my mother's womb. And then, of course, since we all come from our mother's womb, then each womb was a specific story. So I can maybe talk about my mother and how her womb came about in order to push me out or to contain me. My mother, born, as for many Palestinians and people in the so-called third or decolonized world, in a time where these societies' belief in the specificity of the birth date was not as important, the surveillance of birth certificates, locations, health, APGAR scores, etc. So we don't really know exactly when my mom was born. In the Gaza Strip, she's registered as born on April 18, 49, but that's likely when her family realized that they have a newborn and that there's a possibility, for example, to the importance of registering the new life might come in handy a little later as UNRWA was coming in because they would get more. And so what I know is that this means that my grandmother marched pregnant with my mom on foot from Asdod, about 20 kilometers north of Gaza, to Gaza, to reach northern Gaza at the time and stay there in the sort of the early safe zone of arrival in late 48 in October. My grandmother, Aisha, comes from Yibna, but is married to my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, who's a Joudah, who's from Asdod. There was a connection between the two villages, the two families, Najjar and Joudah, and I know the Najjar is a common name all over the Arab world and Palestine as well. As a wife, she moved into Asdod with her husband. And then actually the Yibna people, who were expelled earlier than the Asdod people, moved in the latter months or so when the Egyptians were still there, the Egyptian army was still there in 48, moved over, some of them, because they had relatives or because it was the next big town or village over, about 5,000 people, just like Yibna. They sort of moved over into Asdod. And then they eventually hordes came out at the end of October. And so when I think that I come from the womb of a woman who was in the womb of a woman who was marching on foot, I pause for a long time. And I understand it's a human story, ubiquitous, unfortunately, but it is part of this insistence on recognizing our fullness as Palestinians to tell these stories and for them to have the same meaning as they do for other people, the same, I don't want to even say always compassion or humanity, but also the same force. At the time, my father was about 12, 14, or 14, 16, we don't know, depending on when his birth certificate in 1934 was accurately issued or not. And he had grown up in Ashdod. He had seen his older brothers participate in the Great Revolt, the Great Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939, which really freaked out the British colonial regime and crushed Palestinian resistance. Many people don't know this because we keep talking about 48, that actually our revolution started with the Balfour Declaration, but it really reached its height in the 1930s. And there was this kind of a depletion and a drain of our society, so that when 48 came, so many of the communities were exhausted. They were in a mode of disorientation or disintegration, or as we say, sometimes a warrior's or a revolutionary's rest, hibernation, because you're so exhausted from having faced the brutality of the British imperial force and connivance and have been met with a heavy hand. So my father grew up with this, and it's a sense of belonging in him as a historian. He tells these stories, but every time when he tells these stories, all I can see and smell is the soil, because they were farmers and they were landowners. All the stories, the background of them is a relationship to the land, to the soil. And I can always smell it. And those are the two people in a nutshell that I come from. He was just telling me, in fact, yesterday, how for 2 years they stayed in what we call khaymat shar, a camel tent, a camel hair tent, quite sturdy. And he says it wasn't a massive drop from the mud houses they lived in Ashdod, as there is a massive drop in the tarp tents, which I think are worse than camel hair tents for people now in Gaza. And they stayed in northern Gaza for 2 years. Then they decided to move to Deir al-Balah. And they also stayed for another 2 years in a tent before they actually were rented a land to farm and build their own mud houses on. And then, of course, they moved on to concrete houses. And this was in the 1950s. And then, of course, he went home to college in Cairo. And then from there, went and taught secondary school in Saudi Arabia in the 1950s, built a career and savings for himself so he can actually pursue his graduate school studies in the US, which he did, and got his master's in history in Austin, PhD in Ann Arbor, and then came back to teach in Austin for 1 year as a lecturer at the time. I guess it's the equivalent of the postdoctoral fellows we have today. And that year is the year that I was born, on January 1st, 1971 in Austin. Less than a year and a half later, he decided to go back to Benghazi, Libya, to teach there because he wanted to teach in an Arabic society. And also, I think, because Mom at the time had found it very difficult to imagine a continued life in the US away from her sisters in particular, and mother, and of course her brothers, but family in general. And this is something really difficult to describe briefly. But because their wedding, my parents' wedding, never happened, was supposed to happen in the summer of 1967. And then, of course, the June War, the Six-Day War happened, and the occupation of Gaza and the West Bank happened, the Israeli occupation of it. And so she remembers this kind of period where she began to dream of romance, and you'll go and see the world and you will come back to us and you will help the rest of the family, and you're marrying a good man and he's educated and this and that, suddenly just came rapidly into, not just down into flames, but in utter horror to see that you were leaving everyone you love behind in utter uncertainty, an uncertainty that would continue for the rest of her life and the rest of ours, with continuing narratives of pain, sumud, resistance, and loss. It's not just the 1967 moment, but it's also the entire previous 18 years of her life. Because you grow up as a child surrounded by that environment of a people who are keen to provide for you, protect your opportunities for education, and something inside them as you come into the world and meet the eyes of your parents or uncles or neighbors, you're meeting something that had already come broken into you and you don't exactly know what it is. And then you hear these things about, they took our land, they displaced us, we're not from here, we were somewhere else. And this is the story of hundreds of thousands and now millions of Palestinians at that time even, etc. And even as a child, you don't quite formulate it in your head, except that it is a narrative of truth because the pain and suffering are so acute, not some kind of a mythical story from 1,000 years, but an actual moment that seems to live so fiercely and acutely in the eyes and words and sounds of your parents and the society that is supposed to care for you and form you, the things that we absorb as little children, as without necessarily having an articulated consciousness of them. And then, of course, there is the moment of 1956. So Israel's Britain and France's tripartite aggression on the Gaza Strip and Sinai and Egypt and so forth. But I realized also that my mom at the age of 7 or 8 was also living a war, just like so many children in Gaza have for the last 20 years, in Rafah. And that's part of her growing up too. That's part of the womb that was being made to host me and bring me into this world. Small things that you find out, you start thinking and making sense. It was like, oh, wait a minute. My grandmother, Aisha, Allah yarhamha, was also pregnant with my youngest aunt in the 1956 war. And you start listening to these stories and you start wondering, have I been a bad listener to stories all my life when my parents spoke? Or did I just not connect the dots because I was living in some kind of a safety and a security and opportunity that they provided for me? You're busy in my age with Atari, if any of you remember, or whatnot, new music boxes or stereos or headphones, Walkmans? Or is it because I really didn't have that kind of sensitive awareness to link some data? Like, wait a minute, this story, you start connecting a genealogy as if you're a novelist writing some magical narrative. But these things accumulate in us and they are real. I'm focusing on my mom's story. My dad would take another podcast, but I don't think that these aspects that we are sharing out loud, they are far from the public or collective imagination of people in English. This conversation, can you imagine this conversation happening on National Public Radio for a Palestinian? On any of the talk shows? On Oprah? I don't even know if her show's still running. All that aside, one thing that we know as Palestinians that most of the world does not know or does not think about is that we know the truth and nobody has our back like we do for each other. And it's not to insist on some kind of an isolationist narrative from an oppressed people at all, because we have been, I think, open-hearted beyond strategy, actually from a deep belief in the open-heartedness of our humanity. We've been bred into this world as internationalists.
Wow, that's really incredible. And it's really powerful to hear you speak about your family and your history in such a profound, poetic way. They were both in Gaza, and then they left Gaza and came to the US, and you were born in the US. What made them leave the US to Libya and Saudi Arabia?
I think it was a mixture of parents feeling that they wanted their children to grow up and live in an Arabic world, so that our connection to Palestine was somehow not severed to an extent that would also estrange them from themselves or from their own children and families and the land, of course. And so they wanted us to grow in Arabic. I think it was for me, one of the biggest gifts that my life has ever received from my parents, that I grew up in Arabic, which I think I will also say that a lot of people might listen to this and feel slightly offended for various reasons, whether they have an Arabic background or relationship, or most likely because they don't. And they always think that there's a slur coming English's way. The other thing, as I said, my father also wanted to be a participant in educating a generation of Arabic students in universities. And my mother, as I said, she felt that emotionally she would not stay healthy if she stayed in the US after those 18, 20 years that she experienced, in which I tried to summarize in the story of the womb, if you will.
Yeah. Libya and Saudi Arabia were specifically for your dad's career journey, or was there any other reason?
No, absolutely. It was for that, and find a job, to be in a place where you would feel that you would contribute. Libya in the early 70s was flourishing as a oil-rich state and small population. And Gaddafi at the time was much more engaging from a sort of a social revolutionary status. And it was a belief that, like, I would ask my dad and he would say, there are other options. If you think about this state or that state, it's possible, but I got a good deal. And it was better than certain other places because you felt like you were engaging a nascent Arabic society in Libya. As I said, it was part of this belief that as a Palestinian and as an Arab, there has to be this kind of a Mina or a Swana kind of engagement at a wider level with your own society. Because as you both know, you share a continuous geography in a sense, but you also share a massive history, the kind that no history book can ever decipher, really. Even with the minorities in the MENA region who are not Arabs, or they have contributed to the identity of the region no less and no more than anyone else. And it's all there in our sort of blood and language and colloquialisms and food and triumphs and tragedies with each other, for each other, against each other, etc. So I think that these are fundamental reasons of why.
You mentioned Mina and Swana. You know better than anyone, words matter, language matters. What should we be using?
I don't know, honestly, that I am one who is very concerned about what we should be using. There may be other people who are more equipped intellectually to precisely address this. And I'm not like saying this as some kind of a humble cop-out or something. The modern world has reshaped our understanding of our collective identities. There is also this notion of the Pan-Arabic movement as a response to the colonial age, which was a kind of an ideation of the nation-state model. That's what they did in France and Italy. There was no Italian, for example, and there was no Italy, and there was no France in the way that we know it, and French in the way that we know it, but it took so many erasures, so many oppressions. In France, other people in Normandy or in the south of Italy and so forth. And then now we accept those as some kind of cohesive coolness, but somehow they managed to form a greater, larger whole where other peoples in the rest of the colonized world, not just people in the MENA or Swana region, but across Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa and also South America, which precedes most of these places in this crisis of the nation-state formation. Having these formulations, these nomenclature formulations occur in the center of the power that decimated those people to begin with, which is Western culture. It's very tempting for the human mind to want expression and to find your interior in the space that you provide for yourself or that is provided for you by the milieu in which you live. In this case would be Western civilization or Western power, so that you find expression for your own longing and your own rights. But sometimes I'm not entirely sure of the value of it. As we all know, with the examples of whitewashing, pinkwashing, and God knows, it's all a laundry mat of resistance to those things. It's human enough. It's a necessary solidarity, a necessary intersectionality, a necessary right, truth, all these things. But I also feel like it only really exists only in a sort of the microcosm of Western power, and it's not even a power for those people who are seeking those things. I don't know what Western civilization has been able to offer the Kurds, for example. You would think about it, all this destruction and rights and whatever. Some people would just help take care of the Kurds more. Then we would have Kurdish voices all over Western literature, utilizing occasionally these kind of minoritized or oppressed voices or marginalized voices for the purposes of the liberal or the neoliberal power of the West. And I know that this seems like, oh, he didn't go there, did he? Oh, this is such a tired argument. It was so clear for so many Palestinians, for example, that for a long time, what we call erasure, or what we call Nakba, or ethnic cleansing, or whatever, or what I've always called attritional genocide, was moving into an active, acute, flagrant phase of genocide, which we are now living. And everybody else is scrambling to find out how do they actually state a political and moral clarity against genocide committed by Western society. I feel like we all are trained by the nature of Western society to vie for morsels and think that our morsels are kingdoms.
One thing I usually ask our guests who are Palestinian, and it's a bit of an odd question sometimes when I ask it, but when did you realize that you were Palestinian? And when did you really look in the mirror and said, I'm Palestinian, I have this identity, I'm a part of this greater revolution, if you will?
Too young to remember when that was. All I know is that my first memories are associated with me being Palestinian. Like I was already aware when I think of my first memories that I was a Palestinian. I remember that because, as I said earlier, because I think that I recognized a particular anguish and longing in my parents and in everyone who visited the household, and in this sort of proliferation of relatives. I'm like, wow, we have a lot of family that you constantly live with, and you understand that part of this kind of anxiety and anguish and longing and love for each other has to do with them being Palestinian. And then, of course, I remember distinctly the newspaper clippings of PLO revolutionary acts and sense of a pride in insisting on your right to armed resistance, conversations around poetry. I remember that it must have been 1975. So I was just over 4 years old, where my uncle asked me to memorize the opening of a Darwish poem. And I remember memorizing it and maybe getting a coin for it or something, a quarter of a Libyan dinar. But I did not know until much later that that poem is rumored because of the timing of its writing and publication. And this has never been confirmed, but this is a really juicy clip for Zionists who want to defame us some more. It was rumored that Darwish wrote it for Abu Yusuf al-Najjar for the assassination of the 3 Palestinian figures in Beirut, Abu Yusuf al-Najjar. And of course, Abu Yusuf al-Najjar is my grandmother's first cousin. So it was a direct family matter. And of course, I had no way of knowing this. But I think that poem, that line, which is not very specific to the event, but specific to the Palestinian condition, must have moved my uncle to that immediate association. I am putting this kind of feeling into the story because it's so easy to do. It's not hard to imagine that he didn't have to sit down and tell me the story. He just wanted to pass this on, and that sufficed. In a time of genocide and in a time of societal complicity with genocide at all sorts of levels in Western culture that is committing the genocide against the Palestinians, I am tired of analogies. But again, this idea of the Palestinian growing up so normally and naturally into a life and thought of resistance, revolution, liberation, dignity and truth towards a particular oppressor, the Zionist Israeli oppressor linked to the Western power of oppression, civilization of oppression and domination. The idea of growing up into that kind of truth is not far-fetched. I feel like we have such an easy kinship with many Vietnamese, for example, but it doesn't tell their entire story or ours. We have an easy kinship about growing up into this mode of resistance, insistence against erasure with Black Americans. And we also have an incredible, at least I do, depth of association with natives across the Americas. Because when Palestinians have said, even if it's not the most PC statement, and Arafat had said it since the 70s, we are not Red Indians, or we will not be Red Indians. Or when Darwish writes this incredible masterpiece that I don't understand to this day, I am pretty sure there are not enough studies on what this poem is. The Red Indians' penultimate speech to the white man, the epigraph of which is a quote from Chief Seattle. And the way Jean-Luc Godard, for example, in a movie of Notre Musique, brings Darwish in and the quote-unquote Red Indian. And the Arabic title, the Red Indian, is in quotes. So it is an awareness also of that temporality. And it was in 1992. To commemorate 500 years on the expulsion of the last Arab, or the fall of the last Arab or Moor or Muslim in Granada or in Muslim Spain in 1492. And the poem that follows, the poem on Spain, on Muslim Spain or pluralistic Spain, this poem, the Red Indians' penultimate speech to the white man. I am digressing a little bit. I'll come back to my feelings about the association with the Native Americans, but the ecology, the understanding of the relationship to Earth, so many people had before this Western modernity or the Industrial Revolution or so forth, which of course didn't happen in the 15th century just yet. But there was a way in which humans were willing to honor another human's relationship to the land, in which we have lost due to this sort of insistence on so-called civilization and supremacy. And Darwish captures it in such immensity in that poem. It is absolutely mind-boggling. But what I wanted to say is that it remains astonishing to me, and yet not at all, that no one tends to think of 1492 in the West with an Arab narrative in mind or a Muslim narrative in mind. You cannot separate that, not in the cultural imaginary. There are some scholars doing it, so-and-so have written about it. Moroccan culture or North African culture's relationship to 1492 is immense in its Arab, Amazigh, Muslim, non-Muslim, Jewish. And suddenly in the West, you find the centrality of the 1492 narrative in its Eastern manifestation only or mostly through the Jewish narrative, which is a bit bizarre, since that is an essential part of it, but a smaller part of it. So even that imagination is censored and wiped out. And, oh, thank you, Washington Irving, for The Moor's Last Exhale, and these kinds of limitations that don't have any intellectual imagination further. And yet there's still this poem by someone like Mahmoud Darwish, which is whatever, 10, 15, 20 pages long. And there's no sort of a deep reception of it. Because if somehow, as I said, the history, the intellect, the imagination of 1492, and this ushering of modernity and the beginning of the formal genocides, the Arab couldn't have anything to say about it. For example, I cannot separate what happened to the Native Americans from what happened to the subjects of Muslim Spain. And I say the subjects because they're not all Arabs and they're not all Muslims, but they were all, in a sense, closer to oneness than not. And what happened to those people in their plurality was nothing short of genocide with the Inquisition. And it persisted in erasing their language, which Cervantes, even in Don Quixote, tried 100 years or almost 150 years later, tried to save and insist on. And people was like, this is not Spanish or whatever, but he insisted on the presence of the Moorish or the Arabic element in the Spanish language. But there was an attritional genocide to the point that even most people don't know that up until the 80s, I think, maybe it's the 70s, that in Franco's Spain, there was no other religion recognized by the state in order to suppress the presence of Muslim and also Jewish culture and roots in the major foothold of Europe, so to speak. Or like this beautiful essay that Darwish wrote also in 88 on 50 years without Lorca. And so he talks about how through Lorca, this example of refusing to accept the Arab in Lorca is also a symptom of this problem of Western culture and civilization. We know as Palestinians, and we have known for nearly 100 years, that what we were facing and still are, and now without a doubt, was this attritional genocide that goes through these bursts of phases that wants to decimate us as a people, and an extent that it has decimated the various nations of the natives in North America or Central and South America. And while that resistance will always go on inside the native peoples of the Americas to persist on being a particular people with particular languages and cultures and so forth, why does anyone want to reach a level of decimation to survive or overcome as such as that? And yes, of course, as Palestinians, sometimes we worry that what will remain of our culture? What will remain of our souls if this keeps on? And those who, the Zionists, Israelis, Westerners, who either look away or participate actively in this decimation, they know exactly that this is a possibility, and this is a fear inside us and an anguish, and they either look away, and some sadly will say, well, so many people have been through it. Or they'll say, they haven't been through it enough. And that's a way of looking away, oddly enough. Or they will say, yes, let's press ahead. The other day I was thinking, and I'm going on and on, I'm not giving you any chance to even ask me any questions. I was thinking of like this whole thing of hummus. And people don't understand, like in the West, because they don't want to understand what they already know, what exists, for example, in American cuisine, and how much Black ingenuity and culture and West African culture added to American cuisine, because those people brought the soul of the soil with them. And they also nurtured the soul of the soil here to provide you the food and the cuisine. And so I think of the hummus, and I want to ask people, have you ever seen a nabatat hummus? Have you ever seen a hummus plant, the chickpea plant? Have you ever been to a Palestinian little yard where they actually grow hummus and they pick them? Do you understand that this had been going on for centuries prior? And so that the hummus knows that there's a hand that picks it. It does not know that this hand is Palestinian or Arabic or Muslim or Christian Arab or Ma'arif Shu, but it knows that it is a hand that speaks the language of the soil. And that's the people that make hummus. And if Zionists want to treat hummus the way we have treated it, which means that they have to submit to certain rules of the soil, to certain speakability with the land, then they can claim hummus. But the idea and the vulgarity and the brutality to think that you can claim hummus without knowing what hummus is, because you can actually package it, industrialize it, sell it as a name, as a product, as a farce. It amazes me that people talk about ecology and the soil and the fungi and the God knows what in the mother tree in the forest, which God knows natives have known for centuries. And now we prove it. We prove what we already knew through some kind of a scientific process, because what happened before wasn't entirely scientific to our standards. So we have to re-examine our faith in the spirituality of the human race. Why can't you apply immense scientific knowledge about all this fungi and micro, this, that, and the other, to what natives know about the land, and to how settlers, when they come to a land, they ruin it. They do not treat it the way a native treats a land. And they do not speak the language of the land. In Darwish's poem that he wrote in 1990, The Tragedy of Narcissus, the Comedy of Silver, an epic poem he wanted to commemorate the First Intifada, because he realized that he was witnessing, as we all were, a moment of Palestinian collectivism toward return, because the poem begins, and they returned from the end of the long tunnel to their mirrors. They returned when they recovered their brother's salt, single or in group, they returned from the myth of defending citadels to simple speech. Not that we ever departed from simple speech, but there are these phases. And it goes on. There are several refrains in a long poem, which I think no long poem can survive without a refrain that recurs. And one of them is a stone scratching the sun, because it was as we all know, a nonviolent resistance of the atfal al-hijara, the children of the stone or the children of the rock, as if it ever mattered to the brutality of Western and Israeli culture. And then another refrain in it was "Wal-ardu turathu kan-lugha," and land, like language, is inherited. And I always think about that, because it's not simply, oh, if you live on a land and you speak a certain language and you pass it on to your children, it means that land is yours. That's in the nation state model. But in a deeper, more fundamental, in my opinion, and profound history of human relationship to land, it is for those who speak the language of the land, who inherit the land and the language of the land. And the land knows. I will say this because I will write it in something I am writing now. I understand human brutality, and I understand no human culture, subculture, language, religion, or whatever is above any kind of barbarism. At least I believe that. But when you go to the extent to claim a land, but you come across a tree, an olive tree that is 300 or 1,000 years old, and you actually uproot it or scorch it, or watch it die, or actually steal it so you can put it in the yard of a museum or some kind of a municipal building or something, or you move it to some rich person's house from that same society who actually plants it in as a beautiful thing, and even if it resurvives. What kind of people speak the language of the land if they do not understand what language that olive tree has spoken for that long? For you to abuse it, even the olive tree, you can't speak its language for you to inherit that land. And the olive tree will remember. It is absolutely astonishing that people have lost all in the West their relationship to common sense when they think of the permissibility of the violence and the erasure against the Palestinian people.
Yeah. And I think so much of your poetry, and you mentioned actually Progress Notes, and we'll talk about the book more later, but Progress Notes is a poem that you've written. I also want to mention that you've translated Darwish and Ghassan Zaqtan, and I think it's extremely important for people to know the fact that you don't just write poetry, you also translate, because it shows the importance of relaying that message in other languages, as you were saying. I want to take us a little bit back, Fady. You, as a young boy, you had mentioned at some point that you remember feeling needed and to become a doctor because the world or my immediate family needed compassion and support. So, about your sort of becoming a doctor. How does that relate to becoming a poet? And what relationship did that have, being a doctor and being a poet? Where did that come from? How did that come about? Because clearly you have an extensive both medical and poetry experience.
Quickly, before I answer that, I will have to say that my relationship to translation is first and foremost a poet's relationship, not a cultural relationship. It is my relationship to continue to inhabit language, specifically Arabic language, as I have moved into English, and my life is in English, and I write in English and so forth. I do have a little bit of a anaphylactic reaction, a mild one that doesn't require epinephrine, when my relationship to translation is easily reduced to some kind of a cultural bridge and all this business. And because it, in a way, gets me back to this problematic of like, who am I doing this for here? We find ourselves performing for the immense, beautiful plurality and triumph of rights for everyone in the same place that God knows delivers so much lovely decimation and devastation for so many other places in the world, even those that are supposedly champions. But that to answer your question, for me, I think they're very separate things. I think that poetry comes first, medicine comes much later. Probably poetry came in the womb. I think that you're born one is born with a tendency, I describe this, to love how the music of an alphabet sings in the mind. And I think all humans have that. But some of us realize that you just are hooked. You can't get out of it. And that's how I think of my relationship to poetry. Now, infusing that love or that addiction, if you will, that fixation with content and quarrel with the self, as Yeats would say, or a conversation with a public, with this insolvable question of the I and the we, is a different story, is a life journey. And medicine definitely has an incredible encounter with human experience of fragility, despair, and this one thing that unites us all, the body, the eyes, the spleen, the nose, the pancreas, the toes and the skin, the tongue, the mouth, the sound, the smell, etc. It all makes poetry intelligible in a civilized sense. I don't know if that answers, but the whole thing about the doctor thing, and you understand this, there are many poets who didn't want to become mathematicians or engineers or anything. It was a response to a sense of anguish around me, that it was a recognition of the anguish around me. And there was some kind of notion that a doctor, in some kind of a romantic or pre-modern sense for sure, that has this kind of quality. I know you mentioned healing earlier when you introduced me, but I don't necessarily think that I function on healing in my poems, nor in my medical practice, unfortunately, because I do not think that modern medicine is necessarily engaged with healing.
Can I comment on that? When I wrote that, the healing was for me. Looking over your poetry, reading the words, there was a sense of healing and taking me back, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
So I think through my heart and my soul, I felt like there was a healing there.
Yeah, no. And that's another conversation of how the experience of being a physician, my relationship to poetry, as I say, being a physician in empire is not to be taken lightly and not to be disoriented by the power of it, the luxury of it, the awesomeness, and also the servility of it. You're a glorified assembly factory worker in the biopolitics of system, and you're eventually just highly trained technician, irreplaceable and irrelevant, because the minute you speak up against the system's deliverance of biopolitics, then you're set aside or contained within a pocket that is acceptable for freedom of speech, et cetera, et cetera. And then you find that here we also are living a moment where there's so many moments happening right now in American society and Western society in general, where I think it's even beyond their own conception. Some of us see it very clearly, many of us do, but the majority does not, which is, you're talking about how many health professionals of all walks of the health professional system are totally okay with the genocide in one way or the other, whether they recognize it or not. It is absolutely astonishing that no one is allowed to speak up about it, except if you go as an individual. You're allowed, because as a physician, you went to a war zone and you come back and you speak your truths, and you're allowed that, of course, even if you're censored, but some make it into major media, but not as a body of physicians, nurses, healthcare workers, not as a body that has made and reduced the profession to a business market sector whose function is to deliver the biopolitics of the state, or the necropolitics of the state in some cases. And that's it. And so in due time, we're finding out about AI and everybody's engagement and Google and Microsoft and all these things in genocide. And we sit here and we're still busy listing whether Volkswagen was and how many companies were complicit with Nazi genocide of Jews in World War II. And I'm like, is this what we've learned? Is that we will be so intellectually and spiritually independent that when it's all said and done, we'll just start writing careers and lists and books about all that happened. I don't know what that means, really. I'm not interested that 20 or 30 years from now, I'm going to be a Palestinian who's going to walk around with a bunch of books and industries that shame the Western world for the genocide. This game of shaming to achieve political power is nothing I wish for the Palestinians to deal with as a form of sickness of this Western civilization. And I wish for my people, when our liberation reaches us, that we, just as much as the Vietnamese people, not that they are separate from the world, but in a sense that they're far away from the civilization as much as possible. Maybe I'll never be far, and I'm okay with that. This is what people don't understand. Well, aren't you get the hell out? The answer is simple. It's because you don't understand love. I don't have a problem with dehumanizing even the people who genocide me, as much as you think that me saying the things I say mean for you that this is what it means, because that's the capacity of your humanity. It's on you, it's not on me.
So Fady, if somebody were to hear about you for the first time on this podcast and say, all right, we have his translation of Mahmoud Darwish, Tethered to the Stars, The Earth in the Attic, and many, many more that you have here in the text to you, which I thought was fascinating with the 160 character limit. Where does the reader start? If there was a course on Fady, for example, what would be the first book that we should read?
Yeah, you want to retreat into some kind of a false humility when you're faced with a question like that. But I don't teach, so I don't know what to say to that. I can just speak about what it means for me to have written 6 collections of poetry. It is a bit strange, okay, all that initial response aside, to find yourself in a culture as a Palestinian, in this particular English culture, having to explain even your own art and intellect to the audience, even if it's about go out and get my books and whatever. It is a bit strange, really, not just from the sense of marketability and the consumerism of it, and like spreading your name and your voice and thus empowering other people and other Palestinian authors and whatnot. But it is also a little absurd, and I don't mean that about your question, to find yourself explaining your own work because society can't even imagine how to read you. They've been so programmed to write already about already received notions of when they do the reviews of the books and so forth. Like even this recent book of mine, because it was written during the genocide and it was all the brouhaha about it, I had to do so many interviews and people who review the book are always quoting me in the interviews, because part of the reason is because the society is like finding itself with its pants down, that doesn't have a language, a capacity to speak of what a Palestinian is able to introduce. We go back to the permissibility, the permission to narrate. And we keep quoting this with Edward Said. I think he wrote it in 1984 on the heels of a Palestinian massacre of Sabra and Shatila. I remember the first time reading it thinking that I was going to read about the details of the massacre or something, and it was like the massacre is hardly there. But he wrote it on that. And basically, in one of the passages, he says that, and I'm paraphrasing, the permission to narrate for Palestinians requires a society or an audience that can imagine and accept and receive a beginning, a middle, and an end. And end here is not meant in a limited fashion, of a Palestinian voice, of a Palestinian intellect, of a Palestinian creativity. And what we have constantly is that only one of those things happen. Either a permissibility for Fady Joudah to talk about the Palestinian beginning. So if I just harp on some kind of thing and that's all I do is the 1948, when I transform it, in my case as an artist, about like little family narratives, or the middle, the idea of the resistance and the continuation, but it has to be done in these multi-generational novels or whatnot. And I'm not knocking any of these things, but we're not seen in a totality. Or an ending, which is to say, oh, I am writing with an imagination and an insistence towards an actualization of liberation, for example. So we're, in fact, dismembered. We're constantly dismembered, even in the way that we're received. And so people need to figure out that when they read a Palestinian, they don't need to read a Palestinian in one form of reception. And I go back to your suggestion of progress notes.
I was just about to see if you would honor us with reading progress notes to us, because I think you mentioned it and I mentioned it, and I think it's important to delve into it if you feel up to it.
Yeah. And so just before I do, so you mentioned Footnotes in the Order of Disappearance, a book I really feel closely about. A fifth of it is co-written with my beautiful friend Julan Haji, a Syrian Kurd writer who writes in Arabic. And I say this with all the love in my heart, would sweep us all under the rug, those of us who are winning prizes from the empire and believing our own fecal material doesn't stink, and he's just an amazing writer no one will hear of, and he's not going to be winning the prizes from the Western Empire. But in that book, or in Tethered to Stars, there is a movement that I insist on across a variety of voices and registers, because I am engaged simply not with performativity or not with proof of my skill in English, but simply with my own Palestinian plurality. And that can't be seen. Like they don't, in English still doesn't know how to read a Palestinian across their own plurality. We have to be dismembered. So you can't gather yourself as a Palestinian in one place and be read as such in English. And so it's funny to me that I get these kinds of, and we're all, of course, coming to the surface because we all are fighting for life as Palestinians. This book that was written during the genocide, it's also a bit bizarre to think that me and a bunch of other Palestinian writers are getting so much airtime because we're in a genocide. Like, how vulgar is that? If I were now, after this book is out, if somebody asks me, do you have new work? And I were to share with them some new work that would be closer to progress notes or more of other registers that I've already written in the past, they'll be like, oh, this is really lovely, but it doesn't fit with the issue we are producing or something. Because they don't recognize, as I said earlier, that you're still wanting to reproduce the Palestinian, even as you, quote unquote, center their voices in this world historical moment, you still want to reproduce them in a limited sense. So it's amazing. If anyone thinks that the permission to narrate for a Palestinian in English has changed significantly since Edward Said wrote that article, I think the problem is with significantly. It has changed. I don't know how significantly, not with the backdrop of genocide being a marker. So I'll read now. Progress notes. Our progress wants to travel back to our beginning, to find us with lances and no last names. My issue with the Anthropocene is that I can't get my dog to change his drishti during his downward pose. From snout forward to gaze back between his hind legs. And then all this marine life. Sushi, be gone. Empires, fall down to your knees with your fillets and bycatches. To be vegetarian is not enough. Grow your own shit. Be satisfied with quitting your job. After each discovery, expansionist desire is countered with lust for the microscale. The micro grows a monster, a master. Didn't we come upon ourselves by chance, a bone sticking out of 1,000,000 years? Why won't we open our chests and drop them like weapons for cosmic waves to wash us down? Losses have been heavy. Losses will be heavy. And prophets are environmentalists, revolutionaries, civil rights activists, and meditative beings. They always have been. They tried. They try again.
I wanted to ask you, first of all, if I'm not mistaken, your father introduced you to poetry, and he had said to you, if I'm not mistaken, you can always be a writer or a poet later, but you can't be a doctor now. And this is me maybe projecting a little bit. I feel like your heart of hearts is a poet and not so much a medical doctor, and that's your true passion. Is that a fair comment?
Yeah, I think a poet's heart is always a poet's heart. As I said, you're born, in my opinion, a poet. And whether you're aware of that heart early on or you recognize it and return to it later. So it precedes all the sort of civilizational constructs of medicine or whatever. We can argue, and I don't think I am, that someone who's a physician who always had an innovator's heart or a healer's heart, and they found the vehicle for it through medicine. But being a poet, you're definitely a poet first and foremost, or a writer of some kind. But that comment came much later from my dad. So he introduced me to poetry early because he would We'd be talking about Palestine or about his childhood or some memory from school, and he would recite a verse of poetry. And that would link me in my mind to how poetry is part of the story of life. And he would also link it to language. So you'd sit there and sometimes would choose a line and say, in that line, there's a syntactical twist or a grammatical oddity or whatnot. And of course, I mentioned my maternal uncle, but this relationship to language continued. And it also continued through my relationship to the Quran in high school. But I was always very good in Arabic at a young age, so I didn't really need that particular education. But in high school, I remember being forced by the Arabic teacher who said that if you are good in my classes, that he taught Arabic and literature, you have to attend my Quran class. And I'm a good student. I need to keep my A's up. I'm not going to drop this A's if this guy is really, retrospectively, I would say, inappropriately twisting the arms of the ambitious students who can get A's without this in order to impose his obsession about basically being a conservative Bible thumper, or cement his position at the school as someone who does something and has a club that is very successful and crowded, and etc. All that nonsense aside, what happened was a fabulous education in Arabic and a fabulous education in reading the Quran as a human lyric achievement. My relationship to the Quran, and of course in Ramadan, you'd have to read part of a tradition. If you're fasting, you would finish reading the Quran at least once during the month. And I would always do it on the hour before the break of the fast, because that's the hardest hour. So you would keep yourself busy. But then, of course, that dries your mouth too. It was a pleasure for me to read the Quran out loud to myself because of the rhythm and the lyric and the musicality of it. So it was a lovely physical experience or a spiritual experience, a whole sort of meeting of the two. So I've always had this particular fascination with how language became sort of a science in the mind, but was always born as some kind of an epiphany in the human mind and the meeting of the two. And so I don't really remember the exact age or moment. Was I 12? Was I 14? When I told my dad about, I want to become a writer, I want to become a poet. And I wasn't prolific at the time, and prolific is even actually not even an appropriate word. I wasn't like writing poems even, but I was certainly memorizing them. And so when my dad says, you can always be a writer, but you can't always be a doctor, in a sense, he was absolutely wise and correct. If you are a real writer, it's going to happen. You're going to stick with it. Like Palestine. If you may forget about Palestine, but sooner or later, Palestine won't forget about you, for better and worse, for foe and friend. It turned out to be true, which never left me. And of course, my dad wanted to make sure that I didn't end up scrambling for a secure life. We all know like this sort of generational experience of feeling that you want to make sure your Palestinian kids as self-empowered, self-sufficient as possible, because it is one way and not a small way through which Palestine lives. Had I been just a poet, that wouldn't have happened, because obviously there are greater poets than I am, Palestinian poets in Arabic. They're not doctors or teachers or engineers or anything. And they have definitely made sure that we continue to be alive.
Yeah. What your dad said to you is definitely something I've been talking to my kids about extensively, whether it's about writing, because he loves writing, and it's, no, get your degree, you can always write, or it's about activism. So definitely resonates for sure. I have almost a college age kid, but definitely resonates with that sentiment as well.
Yeah, you'd mentioned in one of your interviews, and I'm paraphrasing, and I'm sorry if I get it wrong, but you said you wanted to do something different with poetry in the sense that as a son of refugees in exile, for me, was not a metaphorical state, it was a lineage. Could you just unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah, two ways to unpack it. One is that I grew up in an age where the reality and the aesthetics of exile were part of Palestinian identity, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And they were in Palestinian literature and visual art and cinema and so forth. I found it interesting, for example, that when growing up, menfa, the word for exile, was the intellectual aesthetic word or doppelganger for shatat, for the diaspora. Also, it was more encompassing than that because it also included all the Palestinians who were displaced from their belonging to home, their belonging to land. And so the concept and the term of exile as a descriptive condition for me that sort of brings about all Palestinians together was what I meant when I said that. But then I realized that there's a way in which exile moves. And I think it's really interesting, for example, to see how exile is mentioned through that phase in the 80s and 90s in the poetry of someone like Darwish, and then to see it in some of the, of course, profound writing of Edward Said. And I think they converge in some areas, but they are different in others. From that time that I said that, I've since moved away from the exile thing because, as with everything in a sort of a dominant and domineering Western culture, it's a way to pin you down into some kind of framework, and people don't even know what exile really means. And then they just say, oh yeah, I love your poetry about exile or whatever. And I began to be a little weary of and wary of this notion of this kind of a catchphrase of exile. And I find myself fully disinterested in it now, unless it is on my own terms. And I like to read it in Arabic. It doesn't mean much to me in English anymore. There's a continuity of that word in Arabic that I don't think exists in English, except as some kind of a discourse, an intellectual discourse that ebbs and flows and whatnot. But it is really a persistent condition in Arabic that doesn't have to intellectualize itself. And even the word can drop. I don't think it's often used anymore in Arabic, but you can return to it because it exists in Palestinian literature, which is in continuity with the Palestinian condition or the Palestinian existence. And it feels different. People will say, you're not saying exactly how different it feels, but I think I did. Exile in English, I'll tell you this little story without mentioning names. I was on stage during the time of reading, and actually I have it in a poem called Tethered to Stars, a poem called Mausoleum for a Scorpio, and actually it is online if somebody wants to put that and read it. It's about reading on stage, and some major and wonderful, of course, American poet asked me from stage, would you speak a little to us of exile? And I thought the question was bizarre, as if somehow, because I'm Palestinian, I'm able to speak of the exilic condition, or I'm put on the spot to speak incompletely of it. That I would be, in a way, both given platform to speak and also a platform from which to be judged on something that I own at a core level that I wasn't really interested. And I remember saying something simple: exile is both interior and exterior, and the two are not separate from each other. And the illusion that for so many, that you have to be exiled, distanced from your own language in order to speak it, in order to see it clearly, to speak the language of the tribe, the language of the age, whatever it is. You have to be distanced. You have to be somewhat, you have to have removed yourself, or you have to been forcibly removed. Even if you're speaking the language of the collective, you have to be removed so you can imagine. And I think there is a kind of a myth in the US, for example, or Western culture that there is a kind of an exile of the interior and that is not concerned with the collective, when in fact, a definition of the collective is the illusion of the sovereign self, of the bounded I or individual. And then you have others who will say, oh, I'm writing without an I, but they sure can't live a minute without it. And I find these conversations to be civilizational constructs that are far from the spirit of what exile is for the Palestinian continuity of life. And I'm not interested in the academic discourse of it.
I'm fascinated by the idea of hope, particularly during the genocide. And if you expressed that hope can sometimes be like vulnerable and complicated in many ways, how do you reconcile the fragility of hope with the genocide? And do you believe that poetry plays or has played a role in cultivating that hope amidst the despair and the dehumanization?
I really speak simply and honestly. I don't know that poetry cultivates it any more than anything else does. It just plays its role, and I don't think its role is that bigger than other roles. I certainly have no way to measure it perfectly for the modern age, to say whether it's a 7% versus 11. And obviously, the question of hope is one of those human diseases we can't overcome. And as Darwish had put it, hope for us and for all humans, but in a Palestinian specificity. But also, speaking of the physician, I see it every day I practice. Hope becomes a chronic illness, right? The human species, we haven't been able to overcome the inaccuracies of hope that sometimes lead us astray in the name of hope, which sounds like it's a beautiful thing when it can never go wrong. If you have hope, then you're okay. And hope about what exactly? Because I could have hope about annihilating others, and I don't think that's a good hope on the form of good love and bad love, but it's all love. And so I think that historically and anthropologically, humans have encountered this and have not been able to solve. But yeah, so when you say hope in the Palestinian context, you're actually talking about good hope, certainly not the cape of good hope. I think that really is phenomenal. And for us, I feel like I understand the realities of the conditions of our time, of the power differentials of our weakness. But there's absolutely, and we know this, it's absolutely phenomenal beyond hyperbole and poetics and all this drama that people think that this is what we're performing. To witness Palestinian capacity and insistence on love, survivance, resilience, hope, sumud. Sumud as a word that grows and grows to the point where it becomes untranslatable. The scenes, for example, of the return of Palestinians to North Gaza. There's so many videos and we're all watching them. But there's this one in particular of this old man. I mean, I'm choosing this one. He says, "What do you think of this Hajj old man?" He says, "This is the return of the soul. I recognize that I am returning to rubble." And he says it with such clarity and ease that he's to tell you that I'm not naive. I understand the size of the disaster, but it is a return, and I will make the return. And I don't think many people understand, even those who, again, as I mentioned earlier, who are in solidarity or so forth, many people understand what that scene means for Palestinians. It's not a question of relief or relief only, at the end of death and the end of destruction and the end of the war, if it is the end of the war. Because the genocide is not going to end. It's only the active phase of mass murder of the genocide that has ended, but the genocide will go on. Like all brutal people love for genocide to march on if it cannot be fully opposed. I think that as Palestinians, we also see the embodiment of return actually happening. We have never before, I don't care what anybody says, "Oh, but you're not leaving the northern Gaza. Oh, but you're returning to total rubble. Oh, whatever, fine." I'm not dismissing, just like the old man said, I know I am going back to rubble, but I know what return is. And in the past, there has never been a visual embodiment of return in Palestinian memory. There has always been the mass movement in so-called the opposite direction. And there have been other forms of return, but they have always been in small groups or single groups. And we can each choose, and there are people who are much more informed than I am, the moment of that. The Palestinians who snuck in the 40s as the present absentees and early 50s from Lebanon and less so from Syria to make sure they snuck back in. Even the PLO fighters who snuck in to establish Palestinian presence and say we were able to return as revolutionaries to the land. They were all in small groups, 4 or 5 families, 1 or 2 fidaiyin, etc. Even in Oslo, with all the disaster of Oslo, when tens of thousands of Palestinians returned, and when Arafat's car went first through Gaza from Egypt and people nearly carried that car, it was a small return, Not all the tens of thousands of the PLO came at once and flooded the West Bank or Gaza, but it was a form of return. But there's never been an image to reverse what happened in 1948 for us and to embody it in the sense that these feet, bones, sinews, and legs, and voices, and eyes performed that return, where it is captured, not just for the archives of the world and the whatever, but in our actual souls as Palestinians, in our muscle memory, not in our aesthetic and imaginative intellectual memory, as also the history of the Palestinian Revolution has insisted on infusing in us through poems, novels, nonfiction, speeches, movies, etc. So that return, the idea of return is real. And to realize that in a moment of genocide, nothing, the crime of all crimes, that you are able as a people, even in small sector, but hundreds of thousands is not small, to perform a return. And you can sit there and want to limit it and knock it down in any way you want, but it is a return performed. And this time it's not in poem, and it's not in novel, and it's not in cinema, and it's not in speech.
I don't see a better way to end this wonderful chat. Fady, I have to say, I know you said earlier that you're not a teacher, but boy, did you teach us today. And I really do appreciate it.
Thank you.
Listen, stay tuned, cause it's time for Sumud.